When I was a graduate student at Virginia Tech, I wrote my doctoral dissertation under Buchanan. So I had the good pleasure of knowing him personally. With that, let me get into introducing the ideas of Buchanan. He won the Nobel Prize in Economics in 1986 for being one of the developers of public choice theory. And what public choice does is it applies methods of economics to analyze political decision making. Now, on the one hand, that might seem somewhat obvious. How are we going to analyze political decision making? But as I'll explain to you, when Buchanan began his work, really this was a revolutionary activity on his part. If you go back to the 19th century, economics and politics were studied together under the heading of political economy. And so I have here pictures of some of the great disciples of political economy from the 19th century: David Ricardo, John Stuart Mill, Karl Marx. These people, when they looked at economic analysis, were studying the politics of it also, political economy. But then as the 19th century ended and as we move into the 20th century, economics and political science split into separate disciplines. Instead of analyzing economics and politics together under the heading of political economy, economics went its own way, political science went its own way. As you get into the mid-20th century, when Buchanan was beginning his career, economics had an orientation that was completely separate from political science and really didn't analyze political decision making at all. Now, some of you, depending upon what economics courses you've had already, will recognize this method of analysis where what we do is we depict an economy as an equilibrium state where there's a balance between supply and demand, and we find equilibrium conditions where the quantity supplied equals the quantity demanded. We pretty much leave institutions out of the analysis. Now, there has to be some institutions underlying this exchange process, right? We assume when people engage in voluntary exchange, they own things that they're able to exchange. What determines what they own? Well, the institutions of society that protect property rights. And it's easy to think about cases like, do you own your car? Do you own your house? Can you sell your house? But the more complicated things in institutions as far as what you own, what you can sell. How about intellectual property? If you create some intellectual property, are you the owner? And under U.S. law, if you write a computer program, you can copyright it. You're the owner. You can sell it. If you develop a fashion design, it just so happens under U.S. law, you can't copyright or patent fashion designs. As an economy becomes more advanced, it becomes increasingly a function of institutions as to what you actually own. Furthermore, the protection of property rights. We assume that voluntary exchange takes place, that trade takes place through voluntary activity. Well, that means that somehow we prevent fraud or theft, but those institutions that do that, they're left out of the analysis. In the middle of the 20th century, several Nobel Prizes were awarded for the idea of the uniqueness and stability of competitive equilibrium. That's sort of econ techno speak. But the idea is that competitive markets lead to an optimal allocation of resources. The demonstrations of this that led to those Nobel Prizes were pretty mathematical demonstrations. But then following that, we were able to show in this same mathematical framework a lot of reasons why markets might not allocate resources perfectly. So we developed this model that shows how resources could be allocated perfectly in theory, but then we also develop a model that explains why a lot of things are going to stop resources from being allocated efficiently in practice. And depending upon what courses you've had in the past, you're familiar with some of these ideas like externalities. People can engage in activities that impose costs on other people externally to the market system. Typical example is smoke polluting factories that now the neighbors have to breathe the smoke. Public goods is another example. A public good is a good where once it's produced for one person, it's available to everybody, but you really can't exclude people from consuming. That might be things like national defense. It's a common example that's given. Monopolies can be a problem that will keep resources from being allocated efficiently. But my point is, having demonstrated here are the conditions for efficient allocation of resources, then economics in mid-20th century showed all these reasons why markets probably are not going to allocate resources as efficiently as they could in theory. And these things were called market failures. And so then the natural extension of that from the economists in mid-20th century is if the market fails, then government ought to do something to correct it. And we've already shown the mathematical conditions that this correction needs to take. So, okay, there's a problem with the market. Here are the optimal conditions. Government ought to do something. And what should the government do? No, that's political science, okay? So what economics did was to derive these conditions for the optimal allocation of resources, to show why resources aren't always allocated efficiently in theory, and then to argue that the government should fix these market failures. So that's the environment in which Buchanan was beginning his research program. And so the idea of public choice then is to use the same economic tools of analysis that we use to analyze market allocation of resources, use them to evaluate the way that governments allocate resources. Buchanan sometimes referred to public choice as politics without romance, right? So it was, you know, if you think about the way that this analysis is taking place, we say, look at all these problems in the real world. Monopolies, externalities, public goods. And here's the optimal outcome. And so, you know, government ought to do something. So we use all these tools of economic analysis to evaluate the way the market works. And then when we analyze government, we set those tools of analysis aside and we engage in what amounts to wishful thinking. Here's the optimal solution. I hope the government will do something to get us to the optimal solution. Buchanan says, no, let's use those same tools of analysis to look at the way that government actually allocates resources. So we analyze government allocation of resources the same way that we analyze the market allocation of resources. And when we do that, what we see is that governments aren't perfect either. Okay, there may be problems with markets, but when we look at the way that governments actually allocate resources rather than engaging in wishful thinking, set that wishful thinking aside, there might be government failure also. Governments aren't going to allocate resources perfectly efficiently themselves. And why not? What are the problems that government has in efficient allocation of resources? There are two big problems that the government runs up against in allocating resources. One of them is information. The people who are making those public policy decisions might not have enough information to actually find the optimal allocation of resources. And the second problem is incentives. The people who are making the decisions might not have the incentive to allocate resources efficiently. After all, when we look at problems with resource allocation in the market, a lot of times the problems we see are the people who are allocating the resources don't have the incentive to allocate them efficiently. Well, people in government might not have the incentive to allocate resources efficiently either. If you go back to the financial crisis and the recession of 2008, what should the government have done to step in and help out the economy at that time when we had that financial collapse. Some economists were saying that we needed more stimulus. Now, we had a lot of economic stimulus. President Obama had an $800 billion stimulus spending package, and along with that, about the same magnitude, there was an $800 billion bailout of financial institutions by the Federal Reserve Bank. So that was, by any measure, pretty substantial stimulus. But some economists said that the reason we had such a slow recovery was that we didn't have enough stimulus. Yeah, we had some stimulus and that was good, but we didn't have enough. Paul Krugman is a prime example of this. He writes a column in the New York Times. He's a Nobel laureate in economics also. Writes a column in the New York Times, said we don't have enough stimulus. Other economists were saying the problem is the government was getting too involved in the economy, that the government involvement in the economy was slowing the recovery. Okay, so we throw some money at recovery projects like road building and we give some temporary grants to schools. And then the problem is when that money runs out, those people that were covered under that temporary money, now they're back out of work and it slows the recovery. Some people were saying that the Federal Reserve Bank intervention into the economy had negative impacts. So who is right there? Well, actually, tonight I'm not going to argue one person's right or one's wrong. What I'm going to tell you is here we have groups of experts. Some economists are saying one thing, some economists are saying the other. When it comes down to it, we really didn't have enough information that we could agree, here's the right thing that we ought to do. We just didn't have the information available for the government to come in and implement some kind of optimal stimulus policy. That's a real-world example. Let me give you some examples depending upon, again, what economics courses you've had. If you've talked about externalities, like the smoke-polluting factories in your economics classes, one of the solutions that we often suggest is a corrective tax on an externality, sometimes called a Pigouvian tax, named after A.C. Pigou, the economist who developed this idea early in the 20th century. So the idea is, if we have an externality like air pollution, we put a tax on the polluters that's equal to the cost of the externality, and that gives them an incentive to reduce their pollution to the optimal level. So there it is. In theory, we have the optimal solution. What's the problem? In practice, we don't know what is the amount of the optimal tax. So we can say, in theory, there's some optimal tax to put on an externality, but in practice, we don't have the information to know what that optimal tax is. Public goods. We say there's a problem with public goods because people will be free riders, and so the market's not going to produce the optimal amount of public goods. It's a market failure. So the government ought to do something. But when you look at the problem, in theory we can see there's some optimal level of public goods, but in practice we don't know what that is. We can't find the optimal level. So we don't have the information for government to implement some optimal policy. In the same way that there might be a market failure, markets don't allocate resources perfectly efficiently. Also, there are government failures that this problem, the insufficient information keeps the government from ever being able to find the optimal solution. And so Buchanan says, let's use the same tools of economic analysis to look at the way government allocates resources that we use to analyze the way markets allocate resources. Let's not engage in wishful thinking. The government should implement the optimal solution. Let's look at the way government actually works. A second problem is incentives. People in the public sector don't always have the incentive to implement an optimal solution, even if they were to know what it is. And this is something that the academic literature hasn't really incorporated, at least before public choice analysis, but the popular press seems to know about it, the general public seems to know about it. I mean, how often do we hear about government programs that are proposed because some politician thinks this is going to be good for re-election. This is going to help me to get votes, right? It's not, I'm going to allocate resources optimally or efficiently. It's, here's a program that's going to get me political support and that's going to get me votes. So we see it, the newspapers report on it, that this is the way that elected officials operate. Government bureaucrats, do they have an incentive to allocate resources efficiently? There's a fairly well-developed theory of bureaucracy that suggests that really the big incentive of government bureaucrats is to maximize the budgets that go to their agencies. They want to spend as much as they can. They want to have as big budgets as they can. And any idea of allocating resources efficiently, it's just they don't have an incentive to do it. So there are these two big problems that public choice points out. Let's not go down the path of wishful thinking. I hope the government does the optimal thing. Let's look at the way government actually operates. So when Buchanan was beginning this research program, essentially because economics was punting the political aspect over to political science, there was the implied assumption that government was an omniscient, benevolent dictator. It's always going to implement, it knows what the right policy is, it's always going to implement it. Government is not an omniscient, benevolent dictator. Okay, so let's just think down the list there and see why. I've already talked about this a little bit. Okay, government is not omniscient. Right? So we can derive in theory, here's the optimal way to allocate resources. In practice, government doesn't have all of the information that it needs to implement the optimal allocation of resources. Right? Government's not omniscient. It doesn't know enough to allocate resources efficiently. Government is not benevolent. I've already talked about this a little bit also. We know politicians have a re-election motive. They're always trying to figure out, how can I get votes? How can I get campaign contributions? How can I get support? Bureaucrats are trying to maximize their budgets. How can we get more money allocated to our agency? Right? So if we actually look at the way people in the public sector work, government is not benevolent. And then here's a key point for public choice analysis, that government is not a dictator. Even dictators aren't dictators in that sense, right? If we think about democratic governments, and we see how our government in Washington is acting these days, no person is in a position to implement the policies that that person wants to implement, right? Because you have a president who's standing in the way of Congress, you have Congress who's standing in the way of president, and even the Congress, you have one faction that wants one thing, you have another faction that wants another thing. So government isn't a dictator. There is a collective decision-making process by which we make public policy. And in that collective decision-making process, nobody's going to get everything that they want. I mean, we've elected President Trump, but he's not getting everything he wants. Where's that big, beautiful wall? Don't see it yet. So, I mean, you go down the list. Nobody gets what they want because there's a collective decision-making process by which government makes its decisions. And that collective decision-making process always involves an element of compromise, always involves an element of give and take. And that give and take is from these self-interested individuals who are looking to re-election, who are looking to boost their budgets. So we want to look at the way government actually works. And if we look at the way government actually works, we see that it's pretty heavily biased toward concentrated interests as opposed to more dispersed interests. If you're a powerful special interest, you're in a good position to get the type of legislation that you want, whether it's in the public interest or not. Politicians are going to listen to you. And dispersed interests, not in such good positions. So if you're a steel manufacturer, well, maybe you can get steel tariffs put on. If you're a consumer of steel, if you want to buy a car or a refrigerator, dispersed interests don't have nearly as big of an influence. So a lot of what public choice analysis is simply taking these same tools that we use to analyze markets and using them to analyze the way that government makes its decisions. But I want to move on and talk about a part of Buchanan's research program, and important to him, constitutional political economy. Buchanan said a lot of what economics does, mostly, analyzes the way people choose subject to constraints. So if people have constraints, they make their choices. But a lot of the constraints that people face are institutional constraints, humanly devised constraints. And constitutional economics looks at the way that we choose our constraints. And Buchanan likened this to choosing the rules of the game. So constitutional analysis looks at how we choose the rules under which we are going to operate. And then post-constitutional decision-making takes place within the rules that we've chosen. Think about it as, setting up the rules of basketball. The constitutional level of decision-making is deciding what are the rules under which we're going to play. What constitutes a foul? How many points do we get for a shot? And an example of a constitutional change, many of you might be too young to remember, the NBA didn't always have a three-point shot. The three-point line was put in the National Basketball Association in 1979. So before 1979, you got 2 points for every shot. Of course, there were foul shots also. After 1979, we changed the rules of the game. So now you can get a three-pointer if you shoot from beyond the line. Okay, so we made a change in the rules of the game. Constitutional analysis looks at how we decide the rules of the game. Then, once the rules of the game are decided, we make our post-constitutional decisions within those constitutional rules that we've chosen. Okay, so even what constitutes a foul? Am I going to shoot the ball or pass? Post-constitutional decision. And like lawmakers in the economy, referees have to decide, am I going to call a foul? What constitutes a foul? And so forth. Just the same way that police and courts make decisions, and individuals are making their own post-constitutional decisions within those rules. We set up rules of Congress, so I guess we have that filibuster rule. It's even being debated whether we should do away with it now. These various constitutional rules that are the rules of the game. Here's how we're going to make our decisions. So Buchanan was very interested in developing these ideas of constitutional economics, of how we determine the rules under which we are going to operate. That's his constitutional political economy that he was pushing. And Buchanan, in addition to pushing public choice and being interested in these purely positive academic pursuits, Buchanan was also a classical liberal economist. He was very interested in preserving the individual liberty of people. So if we're thinking about designing constitutional rules, we want to design them in such a way that we preserve individual liberty. And if you think about it, just think about it from your own standpoint. Would you rather make your own decisions for your life yourself? Or would you like other people to make those decisions for you? And in fact, if we're thinking about government and individual liberty, it's, do you want to make those decisions yourself, or should we have some collective decision-making process that's going to determine the options that you have and the choices that you make? So Buchanan was very interested in designing constitutional rules that would preserve individual liberty. One of Buchanan's books that was cited in awarding of the Nobel Prize was his 1975 book, The Limits of Liberty Between Anarchy and Leviathan. The title is so descriptive of Buchanan's research program in constitutional political economy. That Buchanan thought that we need to have a government to create an orderly society. He went back and referenced Thomas Hobbes, who wrote his book Leviathan in 1651. Hobbes said that without a government, life is going to be a war of all against all. He said, with no government, life is going to be solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. So he made it, things don't sound too good without a government there. One thing we could debate is whether it would be possible to have some kind of an orderly anarchy, which is an interesting topic in itself, but I'm not really going to go there tonight because Buchanan rejected that argument. He said without a government, there's going to be chaos. Life is going to be a war of all against all. We need to have a government to create an orderly society. But the problem is that a government that's strong enough to protect our individual rights also might be a government that's strong enough to violate our individual rights. And if you go back to what we were talking about earlier, people in the government aren't necessarily benevolent. And the same, I mean, it's not saying anything too negative about people in the government. Everybody's looking out for their own self-interest, right? To go back to the words of Adam Smith, the nice thing about a market economy is that people pursuing their own interests are led by an invisible hand to do what's best for everybody, right? So what we need to do is to figure out how are we going to design the rules of the game, how are we going to design those constitutional rules such that we give people in government enough power to protect our rights, but we don't give them the discretion that they can use that power to violate our rights. So this is the dilemma that Buchanan was looking at in his book, The Limits of Liberty. And the title is so descriptive of the research program, right? Because he wants to preserve our liberty, and that liberty, he says, lies between anarchy and Leviathan. Anarchy, life is a war of all against all. You lose your liberty. Leviathan, we have that Leviathan government that violates people's rights. It's the government that violates people's rights. Our founding fathers recognized this, and Buchanan was a pretty big fan of the way that the founding fathers in the United States organized a constitution that was set up to constrain government and to protect individual rights. And if you look back at the Declaration of Independence, you can see that the founding fathers viewed that the greatest threat to our rights was government. If you read the Declaration of Independence, most of it is a list of grievances against the King of England. Right? It says the King of England has done all of these things that have violated our rights. And therefore, we have the right to throw off that government and to create a new government that is going to protect our rights. Right? And so the threat that our founders saw to our rights, the biggest threat was government itself. And so we want to design a constitutional framework so that we have a government that protects our rights but is constrained from violating our rights. I mentioned earlier that little, I'll call it a slogan, that Buchanan used to describe public choice as politics without romance. And he had another little slogan that he used sometimes. I'm really not quite as fond of this, but it's a lecture on Buchanan. He talked about politics as exchange. And I think this is an optimistic view of where Buchanan saw the potential for constitutional economics. So when we look at this idea of politics as exchange, we need government to create an orderly society. Maybe even more than that. That this idea of politics as exchange, Buchanan's thinking that sometimes there are goals that we want to accomplish that we can't accomplish by ourselves or just through bilateral exchange. And so we get together to engage in a type of exchange so that we can produce those things that markets can't produce. Let's say that you might decide you might want to go down to Disney World for spring break. And so how would you get there? So you could buy a car, and the market does a pretty good job of providing automobiles to people, but maybe not as good a job of providing roads, right? So if there weren't any roads, you could build a road to go down to Orlando, but it would probably be excessively costly for you. But other people might want to go down there also. And so maybe we could find a way to cooperate so we could all chip in and build the road that we all want to use. Right? So that's the idea of thinking about politics as exchange. Buchanan sort of divided up the functions of government. He talked about the protective state, protecting our rights, and the productive state, producing those public goods for us, like the roads and so forth, so we can achieve things collectively that we can't achieve individually. So how do we actually know that what the government is doing is really in our best interest? If it's producing roads down to Orlando, or it's producing more statues in the Capitol, or it's invading Afghanistan, how do we know whether those things are in our best interest? And the benchmark Buchanan used here is agreement. When you look at market exchange, the nice thing about it is everybody who's involved in it voluntarily agrees to the transaction. So we can pretty much conclude that based on their own evaluations, the people who are engaged in exchange benefit from it. Why? Because they voluntarily choose to do it. So Buchanan suggested that if we're looking at the public sector, we're looking at collective activities, how would we know whether those activities are really in our interest? Is the government taking advantage of us, or are they doing something that's in our interest? And his answer is to look for that same benchmark of agreement. That if people would agree, then the government's doing what's in our best interest. But in his constitutional framework, he's not talking about agreeing with every single thing that the government does. He's talking about agreeing to the constitutional rules under which the government makes its decisions. He has some hypothetical benchmarks, some hypothetical ideas of agreement, but the question is, would people agree to these rules? And he goes into an involved argument to discuss how we might decide whether people would be in agreement. We don't necessarily agree with every single decision that takes place under the government, but we agree on the rules by which we operate. And sometimes decisions might go against you. But if most of the time they work in your favor, that's good. Let me give you an example to think about. And this is an example that actually comes out of one of Buchanan's articles. You don't have to imagine a system of traffic lights to regulate the flow of traffic. Get to a red light, you stop. Get to a green light, you can go. At a constitutional level, we say, okay, here are the rules under which we're going to operate to have an orderly flow of traffic. Now, it might be that sometime you pull up to a red light and there's no traffic that's coming in the opposite direction, and you're sitting at the red light. And so, in one sense, you're thinking, well, this is a stupid rule. I mean, there's no traffic coming, that I should be able to go, but the rule says that I have to stop. So what is that a good rule or not? Well, see, sometimes you might be put in that position where the rule imposes costs on you greater than the benefits. But overall, if we step back and look at the constitutional level, we have a system of rules under which everybody's better off going along with those rules. So we all agree with the rules, even though under certain circumstances the rules might go against us. And I should mention, because I've been talking about constitutional rules, that this is broader than just the written Constitution. The written Constitution does have constitutional rules in it, but when Buchanan's talking about constitutional rules, he's talking about the whole set of rules under which we interact with each other. That's the constitutional framework. If you go to a country like Britain, there is no written constitution. But they still have the same types of constitutional rules that we have in the United States that governs people's interaction. So Buchanan's idea here is politics as exchange, that what we ought to do is to design rules such that we would all agree to those general rules under which we make our post-constitutional decisions. And we recognize, just like stopping at the traffic light when no traffic is coming, sometimes the post-constitutional decisions are going to impose costs on us, but if they're good constitutional rules, most of the time that we're going to benefit from those rules. And I view this research program as an ongoing program, and I wouldn't really say that, I would say Buchanan has left us with a lot of interesting challenges and ideas here, but I wouldn't really say that he's provided us with all of the answers. And it's a difficult problem, right? I mean, if we go back to the title of his book, The Limits of Liberty Between Anarchy and Leviathan, hey, it's a difficult problem to design that constitutional framework that will preserve our liberty, but doesn't create a government so powerful that it will violate our liberty. And if you look at some of the problems, I mean, one issue is not everybody participates in the constitutional decision making. So if we think about applying these public choice ideas to constitutional decision making, most people are largely left out of the process. I mean, we have a democracy in the sense that we elect our leaders, but most of us in this room don't have very much say about the laws, about public policies. So we might get a vote in a presidential election, we might get to elect our congressmen and so forth, but when it comes down to it, public policy is controlled by an elite few individuals. Right? So there's some people who make public policy, but most people don't have any say. Right? That the masses are governed by the policies that are produced by the elite. So the challenge, the constitutional challenge, is trying to figure out a way to constrain what those elite decision makers can do so that they're not able to impose costs on us. If we look at voters, we think, oh, well, we have the final say because we elect our representatives, we elect the president, our senators, our representatives, we elect those people, we can kick them out of office, we have the final say. But the problem is voters tend to be rationally ignorant. And I say rationally ignorant because you really don't have an incentive to become very informed about what goes on in politics. If you know the difference between restaurants, that can make a difference to the quality of your lunch. You can choose to go to a better restaurant. If you know the difference between political candidates, that doesn't make any difference at all. In the last presidential election, pretty contentious election, if you had voted for Donald Trump for president, who would be president today? Trump. If you had voted for Hillary Clinton for president, who would be president today? Trump. And if you hadn't voted at all, who would be president today? Trump. So your one vote isn't going to affect the outcome of an election. And so as a result, you don't have very much incentive to become informed. Now, some people are very informed, but they're just interested, just like some people are very informed about sports, Right? So you have a lot of knowledge about sports. You got your favorite team. You know all the players. You're sitting there watching the game on television. You're cheering them on. But it doesn't make any difference to the outcome of the game. But some people are interested in sports. Some people are interested in politics. But most voters are rationally ignorant. Now, when I tell this to my students at Florida State, they disagree with me. They say, no, we're knowledgeable. Every vote counts, you know, and so forth. And so to test this out, on election years, I give them a quiz on the first day of class. I just hand out a paper and give them a quiz. All I ask them is, who's your representative in Congress? Who are your state senators? Who are your senators in the U.S. Senate? And then I ask them, are any of them up for re-election? And if they are, tell me the names of the people they're running against. And most students can't fill out the answers to that. I'm not asking them about any policies. I'm not asking them about parties. I'm just saying, tell me the names of the people, what names are going to be on the ballot when you show up at the ballot box. They don't know. How would you all do on that test? You know, some people know, but most voters are rationally ignorant. At the same time, special interests have an incentive to become informed. Right? So if you're a narrow, concentrated special interest, those people have an incentive to be informed. Those people lobby Congress. Those are some of the people who make public policy. So public policy tends to work in favor of the narrow, concentrated special interests and against the interests of the masses, of the general public. You probably know that when you go to the gas station to fill up your car with gas, you're buying 10% ethanol with your gas. Would you choose to have ethanol in your gas if it was up to you? Would you choose to buy the ethanol? Apparently some people think you wouldn't, otherwise they wouldn't have to mandate it. You'd just say, oh yeah, give me the ethanol. But no, it's required. And why is that? It's because it benefits the corn lobby. Archer Daniels Midland is the big corn processor, but the other corn growers, corn processors, most ethanol comes from corn. It's good for them. They're a concentrated special interest. Every year they get a few dollars from each one of you, and a few dollars from everyone adds up to millions of dollars for them. They have an incentive to be informed. You don't have much of an incentive to be informed, because even if somehow you're figuring out how to get the ethanol out of your gas, save you a couple bucks a year, no big deal, it's not worth your time to do that. So voters tend to be rationally ignorant. The general public is not very well informed, and they don't have an incentive to become involved. Narrow special interests do. So the political process tends to work against the general public and in favor of narrow special interests. So we face this constitutional challenge. How can we design constitutional rules that are in the best interest of everybody? How can we design a government that has enough power to protect our rights, but at the same time is constrained from violating them? And Buchanan thought that the Founding Fathers did a pretty good job on this, as I mentioned before. You look at the Constitution of the United States, and it's a constitution that gives limited and enumerated powers to the federal government. And the 10th Amendment tells us that the powers that are not explicitly given to the federal government in the Constitution are reserved to the states or to the people. So the idea wasn't to create a democracy in the sense of majority rule, in the sense of the government does what most people want, but rather to constrain government through a constitution that limits the activities that government can undertake. Well, I mean, one thing that people have been afraid about, an unconstrained democracy, is a tyranny of the majority, where a majority of the people can impose costs on a minority. But see, it's actually worse than that. It's a tyranny of minorities, because like I was saying on the last slide, narrow special interests, a minority, has a way of capturing the political process so that the ethanol producers, other special interests, the steel producers who get their tariffs, they are able to get special interest benefits for themselves that impose costs on everybody else. It's really a tyranny of minorities. The minority is running government for their benefit rather than ours. And part of this has to do with the way we look at political philosophy. If you were to go back to 1776 and just grab a random American off the street and say, tell me in one word, what's the fundamental principle underlying our new American democracy? That one word would have been liberty. We're creating a new government to protect our liberty, to protect our rights. And if you were to ask the same question to some random person on the street today, I think the most common answer you would get, tell me in one word, what's the fundamental principle underlying American government? That word would be democracy. We're a democracy, it's majority rule, the government ought to carry out the will of the people. And that's a pretty dangerous idea, Buchanan would say. That Buchanan has this idea that in order to prevent that Leviathan government from violating our rights, we need to have constitutional constraints on government to limit its power so that it can protect our rights, but limited so that it's not in a position to violate our rights. That somehow we need to figure out a way to chain democracy to prevent it from violating our rights. We look at the work of Buchanan, and I have to say, in a short talk like this, Buchanan wrote so much in his lifetime that I can just only give you an overview of some of his ideas. One of the things he thought is, we need to have a government to create an orderly society, right? So we can't do without it. But at the same time, the development of public choice theory says we need to be realistic about what we can expect government to do. So what we need to do is to analyze the way government actually does work, not the way we wish it would work. To protect our liberty, government has to be constrained by rules so that it's constrained to protect our rights but not to violate our rights. So these are some of the big lessons that I get from Buchanan's work.
When you say, I have a vested interest in this particular,
Yeah, first of all, I will say I'm not very concerned about any disparities in the distribution of income. That some people have more than others, and what I'm more concerned about is how well off are those people at the bottom end. Let's see that we can design a system that helps out the people who are the least well off. And the system that's done the greatest job of that in the history of mankind is capitalism. If you're poor in the United States today, according to official poverty statistics, about 14% of Americans are poor. And almost all of them have cell phones, they have indoor plumbing, they have electricity, they have air conditioning, they have television. In fact, most poor people have automobiles. So what a great system that we have. So I'm not really concerned about inequality in that way. But you raise a good point about the super rich, not because they're rich, but because they tend to be politically influential. Because we haven't sufficiently constrained government so that we get government policies that benefit them. It's the government policies that benefit them at the expense of others. And I'll point to Trump's steel tariffs as a recent prime example of that. Ethanol is another example of that. And I'm a big fan of capitalism, and the biggest enemy of capitalism today is capitalists. Those are the people who are going to Congress, they're saying, we want tariffs to protect our industry, we want subsidies, we want tax breaks, we want regulatory protection. I mean, that's part of the constraints that we need to put on government, but I do see that as a serious threat, that we have this system of increasingly what amounts to crony capitalism, right? And and a lot of people are thinking this is a problem of capitalism, but I think it's really not capitalism. It's a problem of government involvement in the economy. Now, if you go back, think about after the financial crisis, there was this Occupy Wall Street movement in 2011. And they were saying, look, all these government policies are favoring the 1% over the 99%. And largely I agree with them, because look what happened. As housing prices were rising, we were getting more and more people into houses they couldn't afford. But as long as housing prices are rising, if you can't afford your house, sell it, pay off the mortgage, and take the difference. But then there's a housing market collapse, so no longer can you sell your house because you owe more on the mortgage, and then there's a recession. So you've lost your job, you can't pay your mortgage, you've lost your house, right? And so what's the public policy on that? Well, what happens is, we say, oh, you can't pay your mortgage? Too bad. You're out of your house, we're foreclosing on you. And then the government comes in and bails out those Wall Street banks that are holding the mortgages, right? It's benefiting the 1% at the expense of the 99%. So along those lines, I'm 100% with the Occupy Wall Street people. But here's where I see a division. The way I look at it, the problem is this government policy. The problem is we have government that's getting involved in the economy. And on the political left, people are saying, we need more government, we need more restrictions and so forth. But who are the people who design those policies? They're the elite. They're the people who are benefiting. The problem is not, more government doesn't solve the problem. It creates more problems. So I think what we need to do is to get government out of housing markets, out of regulation, get rid of the tariffs. We need less government, because the benefit that goes to the elite, and I don't begrudge people who make their money in the market producing good products, that Steve Jobs made a fortune at Apple, and so now, lots of us have iPhones and iPads. Okay, that's great. But when you're making your money through government protections, you're Archer Daniels Midland, and you've convinced Congress that we need to have 10% ethanol in our gasoline, that's pernicious. That's damaging to our market economy. So I would agree with you on the influence of the elite, and I think the way to do that is to get the government out of the economy. We don't need more government, we need less government.
I found it very dark. Statist institutions, government institutions want to get bigger. Bureaucrats want to spend more money all the time, and the public wants to vote its largest.
Yeah.
So the bottom line is, how do we get construction of government out of that?
Yeah, and that's exactly the constitutional challenge that Buchanan was looking at. So he was saying, let's see if we can design constitutional rules such that we can constrain government to keep them from taking advantage of us. And this idea of politics as exchange, he's thinking, well, what we need to do is to look for ways to design constitutional rules such that we constrain government from hurting us, and we enable government to produce things that are to our advantage. But I don't think that constitutional program really was complete, in the sense that we don't actually have a list of rules and processes that will enable us to do that. I think there's a remaining challenge in that, and in a way, you say Buchanan is very dark. I'm almost thinking maybe he's too bright, in the sense that he has this politics as exchange framework. But the problem is there are only a few people who are engaging in the exchange, and like he's saying, too often they're taking advantage of the process for their own benefit. That's that constitutional challenge. And nevertheless, to end on an optimistic note, nevertheless, look how well off we are with our cell phones and our air-conditioned cars, and at least as our standard of living increases, I'm thinking we're winning the battle, but it's going to be a constant battle. And most of it is a war of ideas, that we need to convince people that their liberty is worth something. And I hate to get too political, but like you have people like Bernie Sanders who say, well, socialism, that's the answer. Great. All of us want to be like Venezuela. All of us want to be like Cuba. All of us want to be like North Korea. We need to see the virtues. We just take for granted the virtues of this capitalist system that's made us so wealthy. And what we need to do is to recognize we need to work to preserve it.
I don't know if this country right now could agree on deconstructing one federal government. I grew up and graduated high school before there was a Department of Education. In my senior year, I was reading Kierkegaard and Camus. And I don't think we could get agreement on deconstructing the Department of Education today. What do we have agreement on?
Things look pretty contentious right now. But nevertheless, optimistically, I mean, maybe gridlock is the best thing that we can hope for. Things are pretty good, really, right? I mean, one of the things Buchanan observed is he was somewhat pessimistic. He said, looking over the short run, I tend to be pessimistic and see bad things, but over the decades, things have really turned out better than I thought they would. Thank you.